History tends to remember the villains we see in court, the ones put on trial, the ones whose faces are splashed across documentaries, movies, and school textbooks. That's why most people have heard of Mengele, Himmler, and Auschwitz. But ask the average person about Dr. Shiro Ishii, Harbin, or Unit 731, and you'll likely get a blank stare. Yet what happened in a quiet corner of northeastern China may be among the most horrific episodes of the 20th century. Unit 731 was not a fringe death cult or a rogue military unit. It was an official division of the Imperial Japanese Army, tasked with researching biological and chemical warfare. Operating from 1936 to 1945, it became a factory of death. A sprawling 6-square-kilometer complex near Harbin, in the puppet state of Manchukuo, was its main hub. It included research labs, autopsy rooms, crematoria, prison cells, and execution chambers. At its peak, Unit 731 employed over 3,000 personnel, including doctors, scientists, engineers, and soldiers. Their task? Experimenting on live human beings. Without anesthesia, without consent, without mercy. The victims were mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. But Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and even Allied soldiers, mostly captured Americans, were also used. They were referred to as Maryuta, or logs. The nickname came from the cover story that Unit 731 was simply a lumber mill. But it also reflected the utter dehumanization of their victims. These people were dissected alive, injected with deadly pathogens, frozen, burned, exploded, and studied in the name of science. Estimates of the death toll vary, but conservative figures place it between 200,000 to 300,000. That would make Unit 731 one of the deadliest war crimes in modern history, on par with the Holocaust. So why isn't it taught in Western schools? Why are so few documentaries made about it? The answer is geopolitical. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the United States secretly struck a deal with the leaders of Unit 731. In exchange for their research data on biological warfare, which the US feared the Soviets might acquire, the Americans offered immunity. Dr. Shiro Ishii and his colleagues were never prosecuted. Some even went on to hold prestigious government or academic positions in post-war Japan. This was a calculated silence. In this documentary, we will pull back the curtain. No censorship, no propaganda, just the raw, disturbing truth. Because justice delayed is still justice denied, and history erased is history repeated. If you want to understand the full truth behind one of the darkest chapters of World War II, stay with us till the end, and consider subscribing so you never miss the deep dives that history's mainstream leaves out. To understand how Unit 731 came into existence, we need to go back, not to 1936, but to 1868. That year marked the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, when Japan transitioned from a feudal society into a centralized empire. Western powers were colonizing Asia at a rapid pace. China had been humiliated in the Opium Wars. India was under British rule. The Japanese leadership feared the same fate. So they modernized. Fast. In just a few decades, Japan built railways, factories, a modern navy, and a national army. But modernization came with an edge: ultranationalism. By the early 20th century, Japan believed it had not only caught up with the West, but had a divine right to dominate Asia. The ideology of Hakko Ikkyu, 8 corners of the world under one roof, painted Japan as a liberator of Asia, but in practice, it became an imperial aggressor. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was the turning point. Japan staged the Mukden Incident as a pretext to occupy Chinese territory. The League of Nations condemned it. Japan walked out. From that moment on, the empire was on a collision course with global norms. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The same year, the Nanjing Massacre claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Rape, mass executions, and brutality became standard tactics. But behind the front lines, another war was being waged, one hidden from the public eye. The Imperial Japanese Army needed new weapons, not just bullets, but bacteria. They needed minds who could harness science for war. That's where Dr. Shiro Ishii entered the picture. A microbiologist with grand ambitions, Ishii convinced the military that biological warfare could make Japan a global superpower. This wasn't just science gone wrong. It was nationalism weaponized. The state machinery, from the emperor down to field soldiers, operated under the belief that non-Japanese lives were expendable. That belief laid the foundation for what Unit 731 would become. Because once you strip people of their humanity, anything becomes possible. Dr. Shiro Ishii was no madman in a basement. He was a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions. By the late 1920s, Ishii had already begun pushing for biological warfare as the next frontier of military science. He studied germ theory in Europe and the United States. What he saw wasn't just medical progress, it was potential. Ishii believed bacteria could be deadlier than bombs. He argued that for a fraction of the cost of a bullet, you could unleash a plague. He persuaded the Japanese military that germ weapons were the key to winning wars. In 1932, with funding from the army, Ishii built his first prototype lab, Zhangma Fortress in Bayant, Manchuria. Officially, it was a water purification plant. In reality, it was a prison laboratory where Chinese captives were subjected to medical experiments, vivisections, disease testing, organ removal. It was here that Ishii refined both his methodology and his ideology. But Zhangma was just the beginning. By 1936, with backing from the highest levels of the Imperial Army, Ishii expanded operations into the massive facility known as Unit 731 near Harbin. This wasn't a secret side project. Ishii reported directly to top brass and received visits from elite generals. His work was considered patriotic, even noble. What made Ishii especially dangerous wasn't just his ambition. It was his charisma. He knew how to manipulate bureaucracies, charm superiors, and cloak horror in the language of science. He recruited Japan's brightest medical minds, offering prestige and unlimited resources. He framed his experiments as necessary sacrifices for national defense. He dehumanized victims as subhuman, or worse, as tools. Mayuta. He wasn't a lone wolf. He was a leader, a network builder, and most disturbingly, a man whose crimes were rewarded, not punished. After the war, Ishii was never tried. In fact, he lived out his life peacefully in Japan. That's not a footnote. That's the core of this story. Because Ishii wasn't the exception. He was the system. If hell had a blueprint, Unit 731 would be it. The facility, built in Pingfang district near Harbin, was a sprawling complex covering more than 6 square kilometers. It had over 150 buildings. From the outside, it resembled a military base or industrial facility. But inside, it was a coldly efficient system of death and experimentation. A place where science was used to destroy life rather than preserve it. The complex included cell blocks to hold prisoners, laboratories for experimentation, incinerators to dispose of bodies, and even an airfield to support aerial testing of biological weapons. There were dissecting rooms with drainage ditches to wash away blood. Cold chambers where human beings were frozen alive to study frostbite. Pressure chambers to test the limits of human endurance. Gas chambers. Centrifuges. And all of it operated under strict secrecy and military discipline. Each building had a function. Block row housed male prisoners. Block Ha, females. Children were often kept with their mothers until the moment of selection. There was a crematorium where the bodies were burned after dissection. The ashes were dumped in nearby rivers or buried in mass graves. The security was tight. The outer perimeter had electrified fences. Armed guards patrolled constantly. Even the staff lived in housing quarters nearby. With schools and recreation centers, normalcy surrounded atrocity. Most staff were young men in their 20s and 30s, doctors, nurses, orderlies. Many claimed after the war that they were just following orders. But records show that participation in vivisection and experimentation was a regular part of their duties. Among the most chilling elements was the surgical theater. Here, Mayuta, the human test subjects, were dissected alive. Anesthesia was deliberately avoided so as not to interfere with data. Organs were removed one by one to observe how long the subject would survive. Some were injected with syphilis, cholera, or anthrax. Others were exposed to bombs laced with bacteria to simulate battlefield conditions. Outside the labs, the unit also tested on entire villages. Fleas infected with bubonic plague were dropped from planes. Wells were poisoned. These real-world experiments would later inform Japanese strategies in places like Ningbo and Changde, where outbreaks were used as weapons. This was not random madness. It was systematized evil. A state-funded, army-managed scientific death machine. Every experiment had a purpose: to make Japan invincible through bacteriological warfare. Every building played its part. Every brick laid in the compound of Pingfeng was a step further away from humanity, and no one stopped them. At the heart of Unit 731's horror were the experiments. Not accidents, not excesses, but calculated procedures designed to push the limits of human suffering, all in the name of military science. Vivisection was the most infamous. Prisoners were cut open while fully conscious. Organs were removed one by one: livers, lungs, kidneys, sometimes to see how long the body could survive without them. Others had limbs amputated and reattached to the opposite side, or were exposed to extreme cold to measure the onset of frostbite. In some cases, limbs were frozen, then thawed and beaten with sticks to study the effects of gangrene. Syphilis was deliberately transmitted to male and female prisoners through forced rape or injections. Pregnant women were infected to observe if the fetus would also contract the disease. In other experiments, prisoners were injected with anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and the plague. The goal was not to find cures, but to measure mortality, to calculate transmission rates, to weaponize nature itself. Some experiments involved pressure chambers, where victims were slowly decompressed until their eyes burst from their sockets. Others were exposed to flamethrowers or bomb blasts, so doctors could study burns and shrapnel patterns. There were gas chambers too, not for mass extermination, but for data collection. One test involved starving victims to death, recording exactly how long a human being could live without food or water. Another included removing stomachs entirely and connecting the esophagus directly to the intestines. Children were not spared. In fact, they were often preferred for studying how disease progressed in unspoiled bodies. Twins were subjected to comparative testing. Families were sometimes kept together, only to be forced to watch each other suffer. None of this was improvisational. These procedures were documented meticulously. Charts, photographs, daily logs, all compiled into a grim archive of suffering, a database of agony. And the doctors conducting them often saw themselves as pioneers, not killers. This wasn't medicine. This was methodical sadism disguised as research. And it was funded, staffed, and defended by the Japanese state. Step inside the shadowed halls of Unit 731, and what you find defies comprehension. This was not medical research for healing, it was science weaponized, a dark mirror reflecting the depths humans can sink to when ideology blinds morality. Prisoners, or Maruta logs, were subjected to experiments so cruel they still haunt history today. They were stripped of identity and humanity, reduced to living test subjects. Imagine a man tied down, his limbs restrained, eyes wide with terror. He was deliberately infected with the plague or cholera, diseases that would ravage his body from within. Some were injected with anthrax spores, others with syphilis. The researchers tracked how the diseases spread, how organs failed, how death crept closer. The worst part? Anesthesia was often withheld. The scientists claimed that any pain relief would interfere with their data. That meant these victims felt every cut, every incision, every searing infection. Their screams were drowned out by the cold calculations of science. Other experiments tested the limits of human endurance. Prisoners were exposed to frostbite by being left outside in freezing temperatures, their limbs slowly turning black and numb before being amputated alive. Others were placed in high-pressure chambers to simulate deep-sea conditions, their bodies subjected to excruciating pain and internal hemorrhaging. But these were only some of the atrocities. The unit's doctors performed vivisections, surgical dissections of living people. Organs were removed one by one, while the victim remained conscious. Eyes were gouged out, limbs severed, and bodies mutilated to observe the progression of wounds and disease. This was not healing, it was torture masquerading as experimentation. Beyond the labs, the horrors expanded. Fleas infected with bubonic plague were dropped from airplanes onto Chinese villages, turning civilians into unwilling carriers of death. Water supplies were poisoned with cholera. Entire communities were exposed to biological weapons, serving as living laboratories for the Imperial Japanese Army. Even children were not spared. Some were kept with their mothers until they too became test subjects, subjected to the same brutal procedures. What drives a person to commit such acts? The answer lies in the toxic mix of imperialism, militarism, and racial ideology that dehumanized entire populations. The victims were seen not as people but as obstacles, experiments, and expendable assets. And as we trace these horrors, it becomes clear, Unit 731 was a war crime on an unfathomable scale, hidden in plain sight for decades. As World War II drew to a close, the atrocities of Unit 731 did not end with a dramatic raid or a public reckoning. Instead, a chilling silence fell over Pingfong. By mid-1945, with Soviet forces advancing and the American bombing campaign intensifying, Unit 731's leaders began destroying evidence. Buildings were burned, documents shredded, and prisoners executed en masse to cover up the crimes. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the world was horrified by the revelations of the Holocaust and the atomic bomb's devastation. Yet, the full scale of Unit 731's crimes remained largely unknown outside Asia. Here lies one of history's darkest betrayals. Instead of prosecuting the perpetrators, the United States granted immunity to Dr. Ishii and his top scientists. Why? The answer is pragmatic Cold War politics. The US wanted the biological warfare research, data that could potentially give them an edge against the Soviet Union. In exchange for this precious intelligence, war crimes were swept under the rug. This decision shocked many. Soviet forces captured some Unit 731 members and tried them in the Khabarovsk war crime trials of 1949, exposing some details. But the Western world remained largely silent. Meanwhile, Dr. Ishii lived out his days quietly in Japan. Some of his colleagues became respected scientists and officials. The victims' suffering was ignored, their stories buried beneath layers of political convenience. This silence came at a cost. It denied justice to hundreds of thousands and allowed war criminals to escape accountability. It delayed awareness of biological warfare's dangers and set a dangerous precedent for post-war ethics. Only decades later, survivors and researchers began to piece together the truth. Books, documentaries, and testimonies slowly surfaced, revealing the horrors once hidden. But the question remains, how could such crimes be forgotten for so long? How many other histories lie buried under politics? Unit 731's story is a warning about power, silence, and the consequences of forgetting. Today, Unit 731 stands as a grim reminder of the darkest possibilities when science serves cruelty instead of humanity. In Japan, controversy over the acknowledgement of these crimes continues. Some officials and textbooks downplay or deny Unit 731's atrocities, causing pain to survivors and anger across Asia. In China, memorials at the Pingfong site and survivor testimonies keep the memory alive, urging the world never to forget. Globally, Unit 731 has shaped the discourse on biological warfare and human rights. It underscores the need for strict international laws prohibiting biological weapons and protecting human dignity. The story also prompts deeper reflection. How do societies allow ordinary people to become perpetrators of evil? What lessons can we learn about obedience, nationalism, and dehumanization? Remembering Unit 731 is not just about recounting horrors, it's about ensuring history's darkest chapters are never repeated. As you watch this documentary, consider the voices of the victims, the silence of the world, and the vigilance needed to protect human rights. Because history is not just in textbooks, it's a call to conscience. Unit 731 is more than a grim footnote in history. It is a stark reminder of what happens when science is divorced from ethics, when nationalism blinds humanity, and when the world chooses silence over justice. The victims of Unit 731 were denied a voice in their lifetime, but through remembering their suffering, we honor their memory and learn from the past. Understanding these events is not just about looking back, it's about guarding against the repetition of such horrors. It forces us to ask, how do we hold power accountable? How do we ensure science serves life, not death? Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's shadows. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. The past must be remembered, so the future can be better.